I want to talk about Darwinism, and I want to talk about it from the perspective of something that fascinates all of us, but that we don't necessarily think about enough, which is why do some succeed and some fail? It generally gets thought of, that way, as something that's pretty easy to accept. The notion that over time things are going to change gradually, and those that can adapt to change will do the best. Now, here's what's interesting. Darwin does not talk about the smartest. He does not talk about the strongest. He talks about the ones that adapt the most. We know that giraffes, in theory, adapted better by being able to reach higher leaves. But what does that mean in terms of the real world? Because the objection to Darwin being applied to business is that it's just too nasty, that business isn't about extinction, people don't die. Well, really. What's the best way to illustrate who wins and who loses? Because the stakes are pretty high. It is your life. It's not about the terrain, it's about how you adapt to it. David Sarnoff is one of the great moguls of the 20th century. He comes from completely abject poverty. It's an amazing rags to riches American story. He's going to meet Marconi, and he's going to work for him directly. At this point, Marconi is one of the most famous men in the world. Sarnoff actually does that. In 1912, he becomes famous as the kid who mans the telegraph when the Titanic is going down. He climbs the ranks, eventually launches NBC, and becomes one of the great geniuses and predators of 20th century business. Armstrong is just a stone genius. He's one of the great technologists of the 20th century. When he's 22, he completely redesigns the radio tube. In the old days, radio, you have to have a transmitter and a receiver. He redesigns radio in his early 20s so that you don't have to carry a 20-pound pack around on your back. As a consequence of the work that he does, Westinghouse buys his patents. Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce at the time, says that the radio boom is due largely to that genius of a boy. The radio boom does represent a quantum leap in American culture. If you can imagine a world where you have to wait for the newspaper to understand anything, then you can start to think about just how magical it must be for the first time to actually turn something on and hear a human voice, hear what the president sounds like. It's the first time you can do that, right? It's the first time you can participate in something that you're not there for. So Sarnoff and Armstrong become friends, and together they both prosper mightily in the 20s. To appreciate just how big radio is at this point economically, by the early 30s, when the Depression is at its peak, radio in those dollars is over $2 billion business. That's how big it is. That's how important it is, because think about it. What else do you have? These families in the 20s, they need media because they're enjoying it. But when things are bad, you really want it. That's why FDR becomes such a transformational president. So as all that's going on, Sarnoff says to his buddy Armstrong, I just wish you could come up with something to get rid of the static, because at that point, radio is super noisy. And Armstrong, being Armstrong, accepts the challenge, takes a job at Columbia University for $1, lives off his other money, and 11 years later comes back to Sarnoff and says, it's ready. Armstrong has outdone himself again. He's invented FM. And so to imagine the transformation from AM to FM, what people in the room at the time describe is it's like going from listening to a waterfall to hearing somebody pour a glass of water. When the radio station switches from AM to FM, they assume that the thing has broken because it suddenly gets so quiet. So he invents this amazing new technology. Here's where the Darwinism kicks in. That's not what Sarnoff asked for. As I said on a previous slide, one of the things that distinguishes Sarnoff is he comes up through the ranks of a specific ecology, a specific time in history, a specific generational spot. And at that point in his upbringing, the RCA is all about IP. It's all about licensing, and controlling hardware makes sense, right? That's how this guy has raised himself from total poverty to become the leader of the most influential media business that's ever existed in history. So when Armstrong shows this thing, he essentially says, I asked you to come up with a filter. I didn't ask you to invent a new business that's going to compete with my existing business. And the friendship is over right there. But it gets a lot worse. Don't worry. This is about 1934. Armstrong then takes FM to the public to try and win them over. He takes it to the FCC. Sarnoff, not surprisingly, gets his back up even more. They essentially go to the federal government and have the bandwidth that Armstrong once allocated to FM taken away and moved. And actually FM today is where Sarnoff moves it to then. They shut him out at every turn. When Sarnoff moves on to his crowning achievement, which is television, they put FM into the televisions, and they still don't pay him. So to make a long story short, 20 years after this, 1954, after a long series of lawsuits, Edwin Armstrong removes the air conditioner from his 13th story apartment and jumps to his death. If you knew Sarnoff and understood the industry, the environment, the terrain, right, the Darwinian terrain, if you understood where you were at that time, Sarnoff did not pay for patents. He collected for them. And that's how that business was. So that's the lesson of those two guys. Darwin. Here it is.